It was pouring like the sky had split open. Heavy raindrops pounded against the SUV's windshield, blurring Malcolm Greer's view and swallowing what little light remained of the gloomy afternoon in the outskirts of Denton, Texas. Then came a sharp, explosive bang. The silver-grey SUV jolted violently, swerving to the shoulder as if yanked off course by some invisible force. Malcolm Greer, the founder of Greer Logics Corporation, gripped the steering wheel tightly, his face turning stone cold. He had just lost control not only of the car, but of the carefully orchestrated rhythm of his life, where every minute was accounted for. The front tire had blown out, no cell signal, freezing rain, and less than an hour left before a meeting that could determine the future of his entire company. In Malcolm's world, everything came with a price: time, honesty, opportunity. But here on this rain-soaked stretch of empty back road, with fields fading into a grey abyss, there was nothing in his wallet that could save him. He stepped out of the car. Rain whipped across his face, soaking through his tailored suit and chilling him to the bone. His expensive Italian leather shoes sank into the thick red Texas mud. He looked around. Just the road, the wet grass, and a sky as colorless as ash. No one in sight. Until, from the distance, laughter echoed through the rain. 3 boys pedaled toward him, raincoats soaked and spattered with mud, their faces glowing with the kind of carefree innocence that hadn't yet been touched by deadlines, pressure, or billion-dollar stakes. Then came a voice, gentle yet steady and sure. "Need some help?" "Sir." Malcolm froze. He had no idea that this moment would forever change the way he saw the world. He stood there in the rain, silent, watching the 3 boys prop their bikes up by the roadside. Their faces shone lit, not by the sun, but by something purer, simple: warmth, quiet, kindness. No one pulled out a phone. No one asked who he was. There were no cameras, no bragging rights, no posts to go viral. Just presence, just willingness, just help. The oldest boy, wearing a frayed blue raincoat, introduced himself as Jaden. He knelt beside the flat tire, moving with the confidence of someone who'd done this 100 times before. "You got a spare, sir?" Jaden asked, eyes locked on the wheel. Malcolm, still stunned, simply pointed to the trunk. The other 2, Malik and Tyrese, moved in like a well-practiced pit crew. One fetched tools, one steadied the car, one began loosening the bolts. The rain kept falling heavy and relentless. Malcolm stood there in silence, unable to speak. In all his years running a company, hiring thousands, scanning resume after resume, he had never seen anything like this. 3 mud-splattered boys working in quiet harmony, helping a nameless stranger on the side of the road, without fanfare, without reward, without even a question. And then just 20 minutes later, the spare tire was on. Jaden stood up, brushed the mud off his knees, and flashed a bright, effortless smile, as if none of it had been a big deal. "All done, sir," he said. Malcolm didn't move. He felt like he'd just witnessed something impossible, something so real, so deeply human, and yet something the world of wealth and power he lived in had long forgotten. He watched as the boys began packing up their tools and getting ready to ride off. And for a moment, he felt like an outsider, not just in that moment, but in a world he had once helped build, now somehow foreign to him. He reached into his wallet, pulled out a few crisp bills, and held them out toward Jaden. "Here, boys, get yourselves something to eat." Jaden looked at him, smiled, and shook his head. "No need, sir. It was just a flat tire." Malcolm stood frozen as the 3 boys waved goodbye and disappeared into the rain. No asking, no TikTok, no name left behind. Just help, then gone. He made his way back to the car, opened the door, and sat down behind the wheel, but he didn't start the engine right away. Keys in hand, he stared at the steering wheel, unmoving. For years, his name had been stamped on billion-dollar contracts, whispered in high-stakes boardrooms, toasted at luxury galas, and printed on spreadsheets that didn't allow for even a penny of error. But now, in the stillness after the storm, he couldn't help but wonder, was he still in control of anything in the world he'd built? Malcolm Greer wasn't just another name in the South. He had risen from nothing once, just a delivery guy sleeping in the back of a rented truck. He had eaten dry instant noodles straight from the pack, worn the same shirt 3 days in a row. He knew poverty not from a textbook, but from the inside out, and it was because of that. He had once sworn to himself he would never be poor again. But as the company grew, Malcolm had slowly drifted away from the values that once defined him. Things like giving dignity or helping without expecting anything in return. They had all quietly vanished from the polished boardrooms where he now spent most of his days. Everything was measured in numbers now: growth rates, quarterly performance, profit margins. Even a simple thank you was sometimes logged as part of a KPI. The SUV rolled forward, but Malcolm's heart was still somewhere back on that wet roadside. The young faces, soaked muddy and innocent, were now clearer in his mind than any slide deck waiting at the downtown conference room, and he didn't know it yet, but that brief roadside encounter would become the biggest turning point of his life. Not on a balance sheet, but within his soul. The city emerged through the rain-speckled windshield like a smeared painting. High rises loomed under the dim glow of streetlights, and people hurried past as if no storm had ever passed through. Malcolm pulled into the VIP lot of Greer Logic's tower, where only a handful of people were allowed to set tires on the sleek black stone. A receptionist rushed over with an umbrella. Malcolm simply nodded, said nothing, and stepped out into the city's quiet after-rain haze. His suit was soaked and streaked with mud, drawing a few puzzled, even uneasy glances from staff in the lobby. In the past, Malcolm would have immediately straightened his collar, wiped away the dirt, and walked into the boardroom with eyes like sharpened steel. But not today. Today, he walked straight into the elevator, mud and all his hand still gripping the wallet that held the bills he never got to give away. On the 42nd floor, the conference room was already prepped. The final round of talks for a landmark partnership with a European logistics giant was about to begin, a deal that could launch Greer Logics onto the global stock exchange. The CFO, heads of strategy, legal teams, everyone was in position. Malcolm entered right on time, right on cue, but something in his eyes was different. He spoke as always, clear, firm, flawlessly structured. Every projection, every percentage, airtight. But near the end, his voice dropped. There was a pause, just a beat, but it was enough to shift the room. Heads turned, brows furrowed. Confusion flickered across faces, used to precision and confidence. Something had changed. He couldn't explain it, but his mind kept circling back to those 3 boys. Every time his eyes landed on a growth chart, he saw Jaden's curly hair dripping with rain. Every time someone mentioned market expansion strategies, he heard Malik's laughter echoing through the downpour. And in Tyrese's quiet gaze, he saw something he had never truly understood. Contentment. Real, unshakable contentment that asked for nothing in return. The meeting ended. The deal was signed. There were handshakes, email confirmations, glasses clinking in celebration. But Malcolm just stood there by the window, watching the drizzle still tracing lines down the glass. He should have felt proud, relieved, elated, but instead, he felt empty. And when the last door clicked shut, leaving the room in silence, Malcolm walked over to the leather chair near the window and sat down. He opened his wallet and pulled out the same bill Jaden had refused. He stared at it for a long time, as if it held a piece of his soul, the part he'd left behind years ago on some old back road on a rainy day when life was much simpler and everything still made sense. That night, the top-floor office stayed lit long after the rest of the building had gone quiet. Malcolm sat alone, the desk lamp casting a soft glow on unsigned contracts and half-finished plans to expand into Asia, but none of it could hold his focus. On his phone screen, Google Maps was still open, pinned to the very stretch of roadside where the flat tire had brought him to a halt. He zoomed in slowly, tracing the road, the trees, the overgrown grass, like he was searching for a memory he'd left behind. Then he pulled up the dash cam footage, and there they were, 3 boys on bikes pedaling away into the rain, their outlines fading into a grey blur on the screen. None of them had asked his name. No one posed for selfies. Not a single question about the luxury SUV. They had just gone. Malcolm held the phone tightly in his hand, and something stirred deep inside him, a feeling he hadn't heard from in years. Not the urge to close a deal, not the thrill of expanding into new markets, not the drive to crush another competitor. No, this was something older, something purer, a longing to return to what was real, something he once had, something he once believed in but had lost somewhere along the climb to the top. The next morning, before any employees had even arrived, Malcolm was already gone from the Greer Logic's tower. No driver, no bodyguards, no tailored suit, just a navy blue sweater, simple jeans, and an expression that no longer held the cold edge of corporate armor. He drove himself back to Denton, not out of pride, not out of duty, but because for the first time in a very long time, Malcolm Greer wanted to do something not for himself but for someone else. The road into the small town appeared once more. This time no rain in sight. Gentle sunlight filtered through the trees lining the roadside, casting a quiet warmth over everything, making the world feel softer, simpler. Malcolm drove slower than usual, as if afraid to pass by what he was looking for. There were still faint wrinkles on his sleeve from the night before. He hadn't changed clothes. He didn't care about appearances. What he needed now wasn't a polished look. It was an answer. And maybe a kind of forgiveness from a part of his soul he'd long stopped listening to. The little diner came into view just past the curve, Ruby's Diner, with its weathered wooden sign swinging gently under the porch awning. Out front, 3 bikes leaned crookedly beneath the shade of a tree, and then he saw them, the same 3 boys. Jaden was finishing the last bite of a sandwich, Malik had his legs propped over the seat of his bike, and Tyrese was casually rolling an empty soda can back and forth along the sidewalk. Laughter floated through the air, carefree, unfiltered, just like it had the first time they appeared in the rain. Malcolm pulled over across the street, but this time he didn't step out with the stride of a man who owned half the state. He walked like someone revisiting a memory, or perhaps like a traveler who had just woken up mid-journey. As he crossed the road, Jaden spotted him first. "Hey, it's the tire guy," he called out, half joking, half surprised. All 3 turned, their faces lit up, first startled, then bright with recognition. No awkwardness, no questioning why he was back. Just open, honest eyes. "Car still running?" "Okay, sir," Tyrese asked casually, spinning the can on its edge as if no distance had ever existed between them. "Better than ever," Malcolm replied, a genuine smile tugging at his lips as he sat down on the bench beside them. He didn't waste time with small talk. Instead, he shared what was real, how a flat tire had made him reflect more than any high-stakes meeting ever had. How 3 kids with one simple act of kindness had forced a man who'd lost his way to finally look inward. Jaden leaned back, laughing casually. "We just thought we were helping someone, stuck on the side of the road. Didn't think it was gonna be all that deep." Malcolm nodded, his expression turning earnest. "Exactly why it matters," he said softly. "That's why I want to do something. Not because I feel like I owe you, but because when someone helps you with no agenda, the only right thing to do is to pass it on." The boys, exchanged glances, a flicker of hesitation in their eyes. Then Malik spoke up, voice quiet but firm. "If you really want to help, there's somewhere that needs it a lot more than we do." Malcolm tilted his head, curious. "The Lighthouse Center," Jaden added. "We go there after school sometimes, but the roof leaks, the chairs are busted, and barely any kids come around anymore. The grown-ups are trying to raise money to fix it, but it's going real slow." Malcolm didn't respond right away. He sat in stillness, struck silent, not by the mention of money, but by the fact that when offered help, these kids thought not of themselves, but of their community. Tyrese's words lingered like an echo. "If you could help that place, sir, that'd be the best gift ever." And in that moment, Malcolm knew he hadn't come back to repay a debt. He had come back to begin again, with what truly mattered, unconditional kindness. He left the diner with the boys. They didn't need a GPS or written directions, just a few turns of Jaden's bike tires, and they were there. "There," Malik said softly, his voice tinged with both pride and sadness. "Lighthouse." The building appeared beyond a patch of low trees, weathered, cracked, as if the town itself had forgotten it long ago. The Lighthouse Community Center, a place the boys called their second home, was in worse shape than Malcolm had imagined. The roof sagged with warped tiles, patched in places with rusted tin wired down by hand. The walls were peeling windows, broken the backyard playground overtaken by weeds and rusted iron frames, and yet, somehow, it didn't feel bleak. Laughter still danced through the broken panes, inside a few kids huddled over drawings, using pencils worn down to stubs. Others played ping-pong with a warped wooden plank balanced across two crates. The spirit of the place hadn't been broken, only the building around it. "This is Miss Rosa Tyrese," said, as a middle-aged woman stepped out from a narrow room at the end of the hallway. Her salt and pepper hair was tied back neatly, a faded cardigan draped over her shoulders. Her eyes held a quiet warmth, but also years of weariness. "Good morning, ma'am." Malcolm greeted her, extending a hand. "I'm just someone who got helped by these three young men, and today I'd like to return the favor, just a little." Miss Rosa paused. She looked at him, really looked. Then she nodded slowly, as if she understood something deeper than his words. "If you're here to help," she said gently, "then please come in." The room she led him into was small, its walls covered in children's drawings and old basketball trophies, each one layered with dust. She poured him a cup of tea and began to share stories, how every summer she had to place buckets around the room to catch rainwater from the leaking roof. How the number of children had dropped over the years, not because they didn't need the place, but because their parents had stopped believing it was safe. "But I've never closed these doors," she said, her eyes drifting toward the yard outside. "Because for a lot of these kids, this is the only place where someone's still waiting for them after school." Malcolm sat in silence, listening. Every word Miss Rosa spoke, every detail felt like it was being etched into stone. He didn't take notes. He didn't need to. His mind carved it in deep. He thought of his investment reports, the ones where value was measured in ROI and quarterly gains. But here, value had nothing to do with numbers. It lived in the image of a child, silently clutching a torn book under a leaking roof, just to have a quiet place to study. Then Malcolm straightened in his seat. "I have a proposal," he said, clearly. "I don't want to donate money. I want to rebuild this place from the ground up. Every classroom, every roof tile, the playground, the walls, everything. And I'll do it immediately if you and the community will allow me." The room fell still. Miss Rosa slowly placed her teacup on the table, her hands trembling just slightly. You mean rebuild the entire center?" she asked, barely above a whisper. Malcolm nodded, steady and sure. "And more than that," he added, because I believe this isn't just a building, it's a promise." Outside on the porch, the three boys had gathered a few more kids curious about the nice man they now called the kind boss. Jaden peeked in through the window, squinting with a grin. He couldn't hear the conversation, but he could feel it. Something big was happening, and he was right. That very afternoon, Malcolm made the calls to his architect, to his construction engineers, to the same building partner who had helped him erect the Greerlogics headquarters. His instructions were simple. "I don't want luxury design. I want something safe, clean, full of sunlight, and big enough to hold the future." On the other end, no one dared to ask for clarification. His voice was too clear, too firm, and above all, too genuine. Miss Rosa called the town office, announcing the plan. At first, a few locals were skeptical, but when the first truckload of supplies rolled in the very next morning, faith replaced doubt. Every brick, every plank, every rooftop tile wasn't just building material. They were signals that maybe, just maybe, the impossible was still possible, when kindness was no longer treated like a footnote. Each afternoon after school, the three boys showed up at the site. They shoveled sand, wiped down furniture, stirred paint. They didn't call each other by name anymore. They had titles now: architect-led builder, chief commander. The adults laughed at first, then slowly. They started helping too. Malcolm didn't just fund the project, he showed up every single day. Wearing a plain t-shirt, he sat cross-legged on the ground, sketching playground ideas, with the kids listening as they talked about colors, dreams, and the kinds of games they'd only ever seen online. One afternoon, he noticed Jaden standing alone, staring at the dusty, uneven soccer field. "You like soccer?" Malcolm asked gently. Jaden nodded. "But the concrete field at school's too slippery," he said. "We usually end up running around the dirt patch behind it." The very next day, Malcolm placed an order for artificial turf, and just 10 days later, the town's first real soccer field was complete, funded by a billionaire, but designed by three kids who picked out the colors. The paint lines were barely dry when the children rushed the field. Jaden curved a perfect pass across the grass. Malik charged in for the shot, and Tyrese played referee, laughing so hard he nearly fell over. For the first time in years, the playground behind the center rang with real laughter. Not noise, not chaos, but the sound of childhood, of joy that asked for nothing and meant everything. Malcolm stood on the front steps of the Lighthouse Center, arms crossed, sneakers caked in dried mud. But he didn't care. The late afternoon breeze swept softly across the yard, carrying with it the fresh scent of paint and fragments of memories he thought he'd long buried. A dusty sandlot, a childhood game of soccer, a place where hunger was briefly forgotten for the sake of one good kick. What had started as a renovation had grown into something much more, a movement within the heart of the town. Parents began showing up with donations: old desks, rugs, storybooks. A local carpenter offered to build new bookshelves for free. A group of college students volunteered to teach free STEM workshops every weekend. Strangely enough, no one was getting paid, but everyone wanted to be part of it. Each morning, Miss Rosa walked into the center and still couldn't quite believe her eyes. The leaking roof, gone. The cracked walls, smoothed and painted. In their place, a bright reading room, a cozy mini-theater, a playground with safe slides and sturdy swings. But more than that, the kids didn't just come to learn anymore. They came to be heard, to share stories, to feel like they mattered. Malcolm didn't disappear once the project was done. In fact, he showed up more often. Some mornings he'd arrive early just to brew coffee for Miss Rosa. Other days he stayed late, sketching dreams on paper with the kids. One afternoon, while helping Malik piece together an old computer tower, he asked softly, "Have you ever thought about what you want to be someday?" Malik looked up, grinned, and said, "I want to be an engineer, like you maybe." but for airplanes, not trucks. Malcolm chuckled. Not because Malik said airplanes, but because for the first time in years, someone had spoken to him with unfiltered trust. A dream, just a dream. No agenda, no calculation, just belief. Word of the Lighthouse Center's transformation began to spread beyond town limits. A small local paper ran a feature titled, "Unknown Man Restores a Fading Community Center into a Bright Space for Kids." No one knew he was the CEO of Greer Logics. He had insisted on keeping his name out of it. But eventually, a group of investigative journalists uncovered the truth. And in a heartfelt editorial, they didn't call him a CEO or a philanthropist or a mogul. They called him the man who fixed the roof and repaired hearts. When a reporter asked why he chose not to go public from the start, Malcolm answered with just one quiet sentence. "For the first time in my life, I did something not to be recognized." That quote spread quickly, and soon local businesses began rethinking how they connected with the communities around them. But Malcolm didn't stop at the Lighthouse Center. He launched a small foundation called Greer Roots, not to invest, but to restore something long forgotten in the way we do business. The responsibility we have to those we pass every day, without ever truly seeing them. The foundation offered financial support to rural community centers, equipped them with updated tools and learning spaces, provided soft skills training, and most importantly, funded extracurricular programs that reminded children life isn't just about textbooks. It's also about dreams. Jaden, Malik, and Tyrese were among the first to be named youth community ambassadors for the program. And when Jaden was asked if there was anything he wanted for himself, he simply said, "I don't need anything else, but if someone ever needs help on the side of the road, I want to be the one who stops." Malcolm heard Jaden's words and couldn't help but smile, a quiet, inward smile. Not out of emotion, but because for the first time in a long time, he felt something inside him grow, lighter. On the outer wall of the newly rebuilt Lighthouse Center, a sign had been hung, simple, wooden and freshly painted. "No one is too big to need help. No one is too small to make a difference." Malcolm stood before it that Saturday evening as the last rays of sunlight brushed across the green field. And in that moment, he knew the rest of his life would begin right here. 1 month after construction began, the lighthouse Community Center emerged completely transformed, from its vibrant red-tiled roof to the sun-washed yellow walls, the colorful playground, the spacious, naturally lit classrooms. Every corner whispered the same thing. Hope lives here now. The rotting beams, the stained ceilings, the dripping pipes were no longer burdens, they were just memories. And this was a new beginning. That morning, the April sunlight spilled across the newly paved walkway leading into the center. Colorful flags fluttered in the breeze, balloons floated gently above white picket fences, and from early on, the crowd had already begun to gather. Parents held the hands of little ones. Teenagers pushed carts loaded with folding chairs. Elders leaned on canes with quiet anticipation. No one wanted to miss the grand reopening of a place that had once been the spiritual heart of the entire town. Malcolm didn't stand on the main stage. He sat in the back row wearing a plain white shirt and simple khaki pants. No name tag, no microphone, no television crew. But anyone who recognized his face knew the man sitting quietly in the crowd was the reason this had all become possible. Miss Rosa stepped up to the wooden podium. Her frame was small, but her voice today was strong, steadier than ever before. "I used to think this place would only live on in memory," she began. But then, 3 boys, a flat tire, and a stranger reminded me of something I had forgotten. Every miracle begins with one small act. Applause erupted. Jaden, Malik, and Tyrese sat in the front row, faces flushed with embarrassment, but eyes glowing with a pride too big to hide. "We didn't just rebuild a building," Miss Rosa continued. We rebuilt trust. Trust that in this world there are still people willing to help without asking for anything in return, that there are still reasons to care for one another. Then came the ribbon cutting, not by a politician, not by a donor, but by the three boys who started it all. Jaden held the scissors, Malik stretched the ribbon, Tyrese did the countdown. 3, 2, 1. A cheer rose like thunder. The red ribbon fluttered to the ground, and with that the Lighthouse Center was officially open. Children poured in like bees from a hive. Sneakers thudded against the polished wooden floors. Laughter spilled through every room. Voices called to each other from corners, still scented with fresh paint. A group ran straight to the playground, the green slide, the red swings, and most importantly, a bright blue seesaw right in the center. It was the same one Tyrese had drawn in pencil weeks earlier, a little sketch smudged with hope. Now it stood proudly in the sun, exactly as he imagined it. Malcolm stood at a distance, hands tucked in his coat pockets, saying nothing. He didn't need to. There was a quiet feeling washing over him, not the rush of sealing a $1 million deal, not the pride of receiving awards. It was softer, warmer, like the sunlight gently resting on the crown of his head. Peace. After a while, Ms. Rosa walked up beside him, holding out a cup of coffee. "I still haven't found the right way to say thank you," she said, "but I think you should hear this." She motioned for him to follow her around to the back courtyard where Jaden, Malik, and Tyrese stood in front of a newly installed board. On it were the names of everyone who helped rebuild the community center. But at the bottom, in a different line, no bold font, no capital letters, just black ink in simple handwriting. It read, "For the man who stopped in the middle of the road." As Malcolm read the words, something shifted in his eyes like they'd opened again for the first time in years. Yes, he had stopped. Not just on that rainy roadside, but in his life, and in that moment of stillness, he'd stopped walking blindly forward. Soon after the children poured back into the yard, Jaden held his little sister's hand, gently showing her how to swing without needing a push. Malik was in the new classroom patiently explaining how to build a Lego tower to a younger boy. Tyrese sat under the tree, sketching a map of the center, labeling each corner with names from his imagination. Quiet Corner, Dreamer's Path, the Rain Shelter. Malcolm made his way back to the steps and sat down. He knew now today wasn't a conclusion, it was a beginning. Not for a new business strategy, not for some polished CSR campaign, but for something he thought he'd lost long ago, a connection to the simplest thing of all, the human heart. The ceremony came to a close as the sunlight slanted through the western trees, casting long shadows over the freshly laid grass. Laughter faded into the breeze. Children followed their parents home, arms full of cupcakes and toys, many of them holding something like that for the very first time. A few adults lingered, shaking hands and trading quiet words. "Thank you. We really did it. See you next week in craft class." Malcolm stood still, watching the crowd drift away. No one asked for a photo. No one called out his name like he was a hero. And for once, he didn't need that. Because for the first time, Malcolm wasn't standing there as a CEO or a man of success, but simply as someone who had learned how to listen. Jaden walked over, hands in his pockets, wearing a shy smile. "Mr. Malcolm," he said. Malcolm turned to him. "I just wanted to say, thank you for coming back." Malcolm looked at the boy, the same one who had knelt in the rain to change his flat tire without knowing who he was, and nodded. "No," Malcolm said gently, "it's me who should thank you. Jaden, you and your friends reminded me of something I'd forgotten for far too long." "What was it?" Jaden asked. Malcolm squinted toward the horizon, then answered softly, "That not everything worth starting has to turn a profit." A quiet pause settled between them. Then the two of them sat on the steps together. Jaden spoke about school and his dream of becoming a PE teacher. Tyrese still wanted to open a small auto repair shop someday. And Malik, he wanted to be an engineer, to redesign old things that everyone else gave up on. Malcolm listened, not to reply, not to take notes or build a report, just listened. It was something he hadn't done in years, buried beneath boardrooms and balance sheets. At Greer Logics, he was known as the fastest decision-maker in the room, the quietest, the coldest. But today he was simply a man, sitting quietly, making space for 3 kids to share their world. A world without stock prices, without executive boards, but filled with something far more alive. As night settled in the warm lights of the Lighthouse Center began to glow. In that golden hue, Malcolm looked at the kids' faces, not filled with awe, not brimming with admiration, but something quieter. Trust. And to him, that meant more than any Entrepreneur of the Year award, more than any billion-dollar deal ever could. On the drive home, Malcolm didn't rush. His car moved slowly through the narrow streets, past low-roofed homes, past the old corner store where the owner once kept a running tab for the whole town. He noticed the kitchen lights flicking on one by one, a bike leaning against a porch. Simple things. And maybe that's why they felt so real, because for the first time in a long while, he felt alive. And it was in that moment Malcolm Greer finally understood. He was no longer just the man who pulled over because of a flat tire. He was the man who had been given the chance to stop, to look inward, to listen, and to let a small town teach him the greatest lesson of his life. The next morning, Malcolm woke up in his luxury apartment in the heart of the city. And for the first time, the silence around him felt too quiet. No sound of kids laughing, no scent of fresh paint, no one beside him sharing dreams of becoming a teacher or an engineer, just the hum of his coffee machine, a packed schedule waiting on his phone, and the sterile glow of ceiling lights bouncing off a polished glass table. But this time he didn't feel alone, because inside him were still the faces of 3 boys, hands dirty with soil, eyes glowing with hope. Still echoing was Jaden's quiet voice. Not everything has to be profitable to be worth starting. And above all, Malcolm saw one truth clearer than ever. If he simply returned to business as usual, then everything that happened would mean nothing. That afternoon, back at Greer Logics headquarters, Malcolm called an emergency meeting with his senior leadership team. There were no slides, no charts, no revenue targets, just a conversation. He began with a sentence no one expected. We're going to redefine what value means. And then he shared, not as a press statement, not as a brand strategy, but as a man who had truly been changed. He spoke of 3 boys in Denton of the Lighthouse Center, of how kindness at its core could be a stronger foundation than any business plan, and how the company would be launching a community fund, not for publicity, but to listen and to act in a way that honored the true meaning of Greer Logics, the logic of giving. Not everyone understood it right away, but no one objected, because for the first time, they saw something they'd never seen before in their famously distant CEO, a voice so honest, it made the entire room fall silent. That afternoon, back at Greer Logics headquarters, Malcolm called an emergency meeting with his senior leadership team. There were no slides, no charts, no revenue targets, just a conversation. He began with a sentence no one expected. We're going to redefine what value means. And then he shared, not as a press statement, not as a brand strategy, but as a man who had truly been changed. He spoke of 3 boys in Denton of the Lighthouse Center, of how kindness at its core could be a stronger foundation than any business plan, and how the company would be launching a community fund, not for publicity, but to listen and to act in a way that honored the true meaning of Greer Logics, the logic of giving. Not everyone understood it right away, but no one objected, because for the first time they saw something they'd never seen before in their famously distant CEO, a voice so honest it made the entire room fall silent. The following week, the Greer Roots Fund was quietly launched. No headlines, no flash photography. And Malcolm's name wasn't front and center. Instead, it was the presence of three boys, Jaden, Malik, and Tyrese, standing proudly as goodwill ambassadors representing the very community Greer. Logix, now vowed to serve, not just sponsor Malcolm, began returning to Denton once a month, not to oversee, but to reconnect. He visited other towns, two places where aging lighthouse centers still leaked in the rain, where kids grew up quietly in the overlooked corners of society. At one private event, a reporter finally asked the question everyone had been wondering. "Why are you doing all this when you have nothing left to prove?" Malcolm simply replied, "Because once someone helped me when they didn't know who I was. And I believe the world doesn't need more great people, just more people willing to stop at the right moment." The story from the small town of Denton began to ripple outward. Across the country, other companies started real giving programs, not symbolic checks, but genuine change. New community centers, tiny libraries, playgrounds built from scratch. Each project told its own little story. But together they formed something bigger. A map of hope drawn across the landscape of America. Malcolm knew he wasn't the one who started it. He was simply lucky enough to be reminded of it, and his role now wasn't to hold on to power, but to spread what's right before it's too late. On his way back from Denton, Malcolm didn't take the highway like he used to. He chose the small road winding through the fields, the same place where his car had once stopped with a flat tire. Today the sun was warm, the path dry and golden, but the view was just as he remembered, familiar, honest, unchanged, and somehow forever changed. He pulled over at the same spot as before, not for any grand reason, just to sit in the car a few minutes longer, gazing out at the wide open sky, the same sky where once three small bicycles had disappeared into the rain. Now he knew their names, he knew their stories, and because of them he'd found his own. Malcolm stepped out of the car and stood in the quiet field. He closed his eyes. The wind brushed gently against his face. The grass swayed softly beneath his feet. And in that stillness, Malcolm Greer was no longer a CEO, no longer the symbol of Greer Logix's success. He was just a man who had learned to pause, to listen, and to begin again, because sometimes a flat tire isn't a setback. It's an invitation to change your course, to change your life. He smiled. Malcolm's story isn't the only one. Right now, somewhere in the world, there might be someone standing in the rain beside a broken-down car. No signal, no way to call for help, just holding on to a fragile thread of hope. And maybe, just maybe, there are kids biking past who will stop, not for praise, not for reward, but simply because it's the right thing to do. We can't change the world with just one story, but every time someone chooses to stop, to help, to listen, the world shifts just a little. If this story touched your heart, share it, not for more views, but so that someone out there, someone who's starting to doubt kindness, might believe again. Subscribe to this channel if you believe in stories that matter, real journeys of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, not with power, but with compassion. And if you've ever been the one who stopped along the way, or if someone once stopped for you, tell your story in the comments below. Because maybe, just maybe, your story will be the reason someone else finds the courage to begin again.